Hello guys and welcome back to a brand new video from me, Pickles Parker Reviews. This is a weird site, isn't it? I haven't done a video with my face in it for quite a while. Why? Because I'm lazy, there's literally no other reason for that. But I decided to put up the tripod and do a video today because Garratt-John very kindly sent me a copy of The Dark Dimension to review, I don't know what it's called, but essentially he gave me an early copy of The Dark Dimension to take a look at and review before it goes up live for the lovely public. Now, if you don't know what The Dark Dimension is, The Dark Dimension was essentially the story that was planned for the 30th anniversary of Doctor Who before a variety of factors led to it not being possible, and it was replaced by the infamous Dimensions in Time. And I pretty much know nothing about the Dark Dimension. I mean, we've all seen the images of the Cyberman, the Dalek, the special ones that were going to be for the Dark Dimension, but I literally have nothing other than that. No knowledge about the story of the Dark Dimension, really. So it was really interesting to listen to Billy's adaptation of the Dark Dimension, and obviously it's a very admirable task to try and not only make an audio drama but try and adapt and do justice a story that someone else had written a long time ago. Now obviously it's not an easy task making an audio drama. You know, I'd love to make audio dramas, but it's a pretty daunting task, to be quite honest with you. And obviously picking apart the scripts of the Dark Dimension, choosing what to keep in, what not, how to work around the dialogue, you know, how to construct it in a way that would perhaps fit a modern audience, I suppose, or would fit the audio drama format, cutting out the visuals. It was certainly, I'd imagine, would have been quite brilliant, but also hard task to accomplish. It's very satisfying with the end product, but I imagine it would have been a very hard thing to accomplish. So obviously it's very admirable that Billy even set out trying to do this, to bring this lost Doctor Who story to life, this lost 30th anniversary special to life. And obviously he sent me a copy here to review, I suppose. It's only part 1 because part 1, he's releasing it in 4 parts, like a classic Doctor Who serial. So he gave me part 1 to review, and I listened to it, and from the perspective of someone who literally knew nothing about the Dark Dimension, knew nothing about the plans of the Dark Dimension, I thoroughly enjoyed listening to it. Now Billy has asked me to not go into any spoilers, so this video may seem a bit vague. I mean, it'll probably seem a bit vague anyway, because part 1 is very much a setup part. Not many key plot points are really introduced. If you know vaguely certain ideas about the Dark Dimension, mainly that it's a multi-Doctor story, then that doesn't really come into it in the first part, as much as perhaps you would think, you know, taking into account other multi-Doctor stories. The Dark Dimension is quite slow in that sense, but I think it's great for the world building, and I think that's something that I certainly think is commendable. The world building in this story is great, and I think it's through great uses of obviously music, dialogue, sound effects, all that kind of stuff to really create this brilliant landscape. Obviously on audio you have no visuals, so sometimes it can be a bit hard to world build, and obviously on audio you're purely doing it with your imagination, but I feel like Billy and the team have done a great job of world building and letting your imagination run wild. Ultimately the vibes I got off of the place that we are in the Dark Dimension, this kind of parallel Earth that isn't really, you know, like our current Earth is. It's not doing very well, to not give away any key plot points here. But the landscape and everything that Billy has achieved and put across to the audience is great. I was getting vibes of Blade Runner and, you know, 90s science fiction. It felt that the tone of this felt very dark, felt very gritty, very grounded, very much like sci-fi, like Blade Runner, quite similar to a lot of 90s dystopia fiction. And I really like that because obviously it is basing itself off, even though Billy's obviously made this in 2020, releasing it in 2021, it's obviously based off of what was going to be a Doctor Who 30th anniversary special released in the 90s, in 1993. And obviously, it very much feels like a time capsule. It very much feels like 90s Doctor Who distilled. I got a lot of vibes from the Virgin New Adventures. Now, personally, I haven't read any of the Virgin New Adventures, but from what I've heard and some of the infamous storylines, they're obviously very dark, very adult, because ultimately, when they got the license, they realised there was ultimately adult Doctor Who fans who were buying these books, so they decided to, you know, break the boundaries and go outside the box of what you have got in the family viewing programme that was Doctor Who, the classic series. And obviously those stories were a lot darker, a lot grittier, and I feel like that approach is very much encapsulated in this audio adaptation of The Dark Dimension. As I said, I got vibes from Blade Runner, a lot of 90s science fiction, because it had that kind of vibe. In the first few initial scenes, I really got the picture of almost like a dark like street with rain and perhaps some neon there. As I said, like the Blade Runner comparison, you've obviously got a lot of fire and scorched things. Obviously, if once you listen to the first part for yourselves, you'll understand what I mean there, but it was some great sound design going on there to really create the world. And obviously, it's the first part as a setup part, so obviously you're mostly doing is you're being introduced to the characters, initial stems of the plot, and obviously the world. And that was what I was most impressed about, because as I said, it feels like a time capsule. It feels like this is what Doctor Who would have been like in the 90s if it was reimagined for the 90s. It feels a bit like the TV movie, a bit like the Virgin New Adventures, a bit like popular 90s science fiction and science fiction dystopia like Blade Runner, and that just comes across so brilliantly, and that was what Billy was going for. So ultimately, it's really amazing that came across. It was just a great vibe. I was listening to it and thinking, this feels like Doctor Who, but it also feels nothing like Doctor Who, and that's a compliment, because obviously it certainly encapsulates the complete differentness of the Dark Dimension. That obviously, the Dark Dimension is completely different from the TV series. It feels like a completely different approach to a multi-Doctor story than what we got in, for example, the 3 Doctors, the 5 Doctors, the 2 Doctors, even stuff like Day of the Doctor. I suppose it feels completely different to that. It feels very unique in terms of its tone, in terms of its story, in terms of its setting. And obviously the first part, you're just exploring the world, and I thought through the use of sound effects, music, dialogue, there was some great world building, and I really loved envisioning this world that we're exploring, where the story is obviously going to take place, in my mind, because this story really created some great images in my head, and obviously that's the biggest compliment you can give to an audio story that's trying to tell a story without the visual medium. And yes, as I said, the story also feels quite detached from anything we've seen in Doctor Who, even from the modern series. I feel like if you took the classic series from the modern series and the Virgin New Adventures, plus some 90s science fiction, put it in there, that's what you get with the Dark Dimension. Obviously I spoke about the tone and the vibe, but also just the scale, I think, is really commendable. Ultimately, this feels like a massive story. The Dark Dimension was going to get cinema releases, and ultimately I think you can really tell with the ambitiousness of this story. Ultimately, I'm not just talking about like it's a multi-Doctor story, you've got some previous villains coming in. No, not that. I mean just in terms of the general scope, all the people involved, just the atmosphere. It genuinely feels like a big scale story, like Doctor Who, but a film, a movie. It does feel like that, and that was certainly enjoyable to watch. And I think some of the characters were characterised well. I thought the vocal performances were really great as well. Ultimately, it is a bit weird listening to some people that you obviously have heard the voices of before, because obviously Billy has got a lot of people you know from the Doctor Who community involved in this, which is great, they all do a good job. But obviously sometimes it can be a bit distracting thinking, whoa, that's that person or that person, and you're listening to their voice, and obviously they're playing a character, but you know them from somewhere else, especially the Doctor Who YouTubers he's got involved, because obviously you're used to hearing their voice a lot. So for example, when you hear Who Chaser or Mr. TARDIS in this, obviously you're used to hearing their voice because you watch them on YouTube, so when you're hearing them act a completely different character, it can be a bit distracting. That's not a fault of the audio, it's just because I consume so much Doctor Who YouTube. That's obviously a side effect for me when listening to these people act in this audio drama. But obviously they do great jobs. They really encapsulate the characters. Obviously there's a wider range of characters. You've got people like Bernie Summerfield, you've got these people from this organisation, these kind of agents, which is very much why I thought that this was quite similar to 90s science fiction, because you've got those things there, a bit like Men in Black, you know, those kind of things, those kind of agents. I want to call them time agents, but obviously they're not time agents, are from the revived series, but you kind of know what I mean by that. This kind of organisation, there's probably a name for them, they're probably similar to something in the expanded media. Yes, I haven't consumed much expanded media, shoot me. Then you've obviously got Hawkspur and his lackey, Christopher Thompson and Miles Taylor respectively. You've obviously got all these sorts of stuff, different political points of view, different ideas about the Doctor as a character and certain things that happen to him, certain things about the Doctor's mind and his past experiences. Ultimately, there's a lot of interesting ideas explored within this story that's obviously credited to the original screenwriter, obviously not Billy Garratt-John, but I think he's done a very good job at putting this across, at adapting this, obviously cutting things out, crafting things in a certain way so it works on audio, so it flows better than perhaps maybe the original one that was made in the 90s would have done. Ultimately, it's a really successful audio adaptation of only as into part 1, obviously, because that's all Billy sent me, but ultimately I really enjoyed it. Obviously this has been immensely vague, obviously, because Billy didn't want me to talk about spoilers, so there's a cliffhanger at the end of part 1 that he didn't want me to speak about, so obviously I won't. I respect Billy's wishes there, but ultimately this part is mainly a setting up, a world building part anyway, just to, you know, set the scene, because this is delving with characters and places and times that obviously we have no knowledge of as an audience, so ultimately you needed to dedicate this first part to exploring that. So ultimately I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the first part was particularly enjoyable for that, because obviously I've mentioned the brilliant world building, the fantastic tone, the fantastic performances, the sound effects, and obviously with the backing sounds, all that sorts of stuff. The music I thought was really brilliant as well. It really set the tone, it really created that 90s atmosphere. And yeah, this is just really great. As someone who doesn't have an amazing amount of knowledge about the Dark Dimension, I found this really enjoyable, and just, you know, negating obviously this being an adaptation, this being audio, the history of the Dark Dimension and what it was supposed to be. This is just a really interesting story and a really interesting take on Doctor Who. As I've said, it feels like Doctor Who in the 90s, it feels like that's what would have happened if Doctor Who had continued into the 90s. So ultimately it's a really interesting experiment just for that. Ultimately this was a really successful audio adaptation, and I really enjoyed the first part, and I can't wait to hear all the rest of the parts when they air, and I can't wait to listen to them along with you lovely lot watching this video. Yes, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoy this video, leave a like, drop a sub, and hit that notification bell to stay notified for all my latest videos. If you enjoyed this video, then I do actually have a podcast that I did with Billy Garratt-John discussing his, obviously, adaptation of the Dark Dimension. We spoke about my thoughts on that, and we spoke about the process of him making the Dark Dimension. It was really interesting to hear his thoughts on it and to hear his side, and yeah, it was just a great chat. We speak about some other Doctor Who opinions in it as well, and yeah, it was just a really fun podcast to record. That should probably be going up sometime this weekend, either Saturday or Sunday. I'm leaning towards Sunday, possibly. But yeah, if you want to hear more thoughts about the Dark Dimension, as well as hearing it from the horse's mouth, hearing it from Billy Garratt-John himself, as we had a great chat, I really enjoyed it, then obviously stick around for that podcast I did with him, which will be coming out this weekend. But yeah, if you like this video, leave a like. What do you think of the Dark Dimension? I mean, you probably haven't heard it, ultimately, because, well, it isn't out. But ultimately, are you excited for the Dark Dimension? Are you not? You know, what do you want to see in this Dark Dimension? And if you're watching this after it's gone out, then hit me up with your thoughts about the Dark Dimension. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. But yes, whatever. Thank you guys for watching, and of course, a goodbye.